Here's some code that creates a stored procedure that inserts a new record into the shippers table if the optional company name is supplied. So the name of the procedure is insert shipper. It has an optional parameter of company name, an optional parameter of phone, and an optional parameter of shipper ID. So a little bit of a contrived stored procedure because there's really not much use of executing the stored procedure if you're not going to supply any of the information. But if it does, it's going to return shipper ID set to 0. So shipper ID is set to an output parameter. So that means that the body of the stored procedure is going to update that information. And the application that causes this code to execute, the stored procedure to execute, is going to have access to that shipper ID value after the stored procedure executes. Okay, so the way this works is that if the company name is null, set equal to 0. Otherwise, if the insert statement executes, then the shipper ID is going to be set to the new identity value for that new row within the shippers table. And that's the value that scope identity, this global function, returns. This is a real convenient way of getting the primary key of a new row within a table, because very often client applications have to insert a row and then immediately use that primary key in order to add related tables as well. All right, so I'll execute this code and create the stored procedure in the Northwind database. And then here shows how you can write some transact SQL statement in order to retrieve the value of an output parameter. So the way you need to do this is declare a variable that is going to hold that value. Here I'm calling it new shipper ID. And it has to have the same data type as the output parameter. So if we go back up in here, you can see that defined it as an integer. And then you can execute the stored procedure and set the value of the shipper ID to that new shipper ID value. As a result, when this code executes, when the stored procedure is invoked, then this new shipper ID is going to hold the value of that output parameter. Now this might look a little bit funky because what's actually happening is that it's executing the code, and this code is going to assign that new value to new shipper ID so that I can use it right here. But this is the syntax that you need to use in order to get the value of that output parameter. And then I just use a select statement, use an alias for it, in order to display that new shipper ID value. Okay, so I've already created the stored procedure. I can execute this code, and we can see that we have a new shipper ID value of 4. Okay, so that shows how you can get data returned using output parameters. You can also use a return statement within a stored procedure. This returns a single scalar value to the caller that invoked the stored procedure. A return statement anywhere in a stored procedure causes the stored procedure to unconditionally exit and return the specified value. So here's a variation of that insert shipper stored procedure. So in this case, rather than using an output parameter, you can see there's only 2 input parameters now, both of which are still optional. Then if the company name is null, it just immediately returns 0. Otherwise, if company name is not null, then it executes the insert statement, provides the company name and phone values, still grabs the new identity value, but then returns it as the return value of the stored procedure instead of as an output parameter. So I'll create that stored procedure. And then this code shows how you can use that. I still need a variable in order to hold the value. But now, when I'm executing the stored procedure, I'm using that variable and assigning the return value of that stored procedure to that variable. So you can see instead of using this as an output parameter, this insert statement, because I have a return statement within the stored procedure, that is now going to return a value, and this ends up being code just like you see in many programming languages. So I'll go ahead and insert that row. As you can see, we now have shipper ID value of 5 that's returned as the return value of that stored procedure. Now for completeness, I also need to discuss about returning a value as a result set. And here's a variation of that insert shipper stored procedure that shows how to do that. So this time, I have two input parameters. Same basic logic. If the company name is null, then I'm going to execute a select statement that's going to return 0 as the no new shipper ID, whatever alias that you want to use. Or if company name is not null, it's going to insert the new shipper, and then just do a select scope identity as the new shipper ID. So this is a little bit different way of returning that single value, returning it as a result set, a single column, single row result set. All right, I'll go ahead and execute this code and show that now when I execute the code this way, I get a result set. Again, a single column, a single row. Or if I execute the code with company name, I get a no new shipper ID column of 0. Now, in a real application, generally you're not going to want to provide an alias of a different name like this based on different conditions, no new shipper ID or new shipper ID. Instead, you would use the same alias and then in the client application test the value to see whether or not it's 0. But how you do it is up to you. You can define the stored procedures any way you want. Now, also I want to talk a little bit about using variables. There's really nothing all that special about stored procedures and using variables. You have access to them, and in most non-trivial stored procedures, you'll declare and use a lot of different variables. So the bottom line is that you use variables in stored procedures the same way that you use variables pretty much in any programming language. SQL Server requires that you explicitly declare each variable with its corresponding data type using a declare statement. And you can declare multiple variables of the same or multiple types in a single statement if you separate the declarations by commas. So here's an example of that. So I have a declare statement. I want to have a num variable of type int and a string variable of type varchar50. Now, in order to set the value of a variable, you can use both the select and set statements. The main difference between the two is that you can use the select statement to make multiple assignments. And this is useful in scenarios where you need to capture values from global functions like @error and @row count immediately after performing different kinds of operations. All right, so this block of code declares those variables, sets the value to number and string, and when I have just single variables that I'm setting values to in a single statement, I tend to use the set statement. I just think it makes it clearer what's happening within that code. Because if you're scanning the code and looking down here and seeing a select here, well, is this assigning variables or is it returning a result set? So it just makes it a little bit easier to scan the code and find different statements that I'm looking for. Okay, so set the value there, and then I can print the value of that variable. And here I'm just doing a little bit of a concatenation just to show that you can use the different values of variables. And then this is an example of using the select statement, which again has the benefit that I can assign values to multiple variables in a single statement here. Set statement, I have to have multiple statements there. And then I can print out the value. And execute that, you see the results. All uninitialized variables have a default value of null. So when I execute this line of code, first and second are going to initially have null values. Then I immediately set first to a non-null value, print out that value, and then print out second, which is just going to be a blank line because this is a null value. And when I concatenate a null onto a string, it results in a null, and then I print done. And so there's the result of executing that code. Now, one limitation of using the select statement in order to assign the values of variables is that you can't have a single select statement that assigns the value of a variable as well as returns data from a table. So in essence, the select statement is overloaded, and you can't use both overloads in a single statement. So if I execute this code here, I'm going to get an error, and it says that a select statement that assigns a value to a variable must not be combined with data retrieval operations. So another error message that tells you exactly what the problem is. I'm attempting to assign a value here, and then also retrieve data from a table. Can't do it. Won't work. Instead, you need to separate them out into multiple select statements if that's what you want to do. So here I'm selecting or setting the value of ID to null, which is a little bit redundant because it's already null, but then doing a select statement that returns that value. That's perfectly okay because I'm not changing the value of it, as well as returning first name, last name from employees. So I execute this code. That executes just fine. And you can see that the ID value is null for every row because it's a constant value. Okay, shut down results there. Okay, most syntax errors result from spelling errors or from simple mistakes, such as using create procedure when you should use alter procedure to modify an existing procedure. Management Studio makes it fairly easy for you to locate incorrect syntax when you do have a runtime error. And here's an example. So if I execute this code, I'm going to get an error. But the problem here is that I have multiple statements. I'm not quite sure which statement caused the error. Now, in just these few lines of code, I get a line 2 there, and that identifies that I have some sort of a problem. And of course, the problem is that I'm assigning a string value to an integer variable. And so I get conversion failed when converting the varchar value hello to data type int. That's not an implicit conversion that SQL Server can do. But say I instead of 3 lines here, I have 100 lines that I'm attempting to execute. So in that case, it may not be immediately clear that where line 63 is. And so what I can do is I can double click on the error message there, and that takes me immediately to the line. And I can read the error message again and see, oh, ID is an int. Okay, and I can fix my code and whatever I need to do, change the data type or change the value that's being assigned to it. So there are a lot of helpful features within Management Studio that can help you find problems within the code that you write. And this applies to stored procedures as well as just standalone statements like this.